Let's talk about item 9, franchisees' obligations. This is something that I think a lot of prospective franchisees do look at, I find, as they tend to, what do I have to do? So what do you typically look for, as an attorney, what do you look for in this section? What's important to you?
I just try to point out to the client that, when I'm representing a franchisee, that this is an important thing for them to review very carefully, again, looking at the footnotes as well, and understand that these obligations that they have to the franchisor, we tend to talk about it. I know we're going through the FDD, but when we're going through the franchise agreement, which is the client's contract, the franchisee's contract with the franchisor, that's where we're really focused because, again, these are all restated in the contract as a contractual obligation. So I think it's very important that the franchisee understand that that's a contract, that they're signing a contract, they're bound for that period of time, if it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, that they're bound and that these obligations that they have, that they've agreed to and signed on that contract are a binding legal document that they can be sued on if they don't comply with. And so I think it's very important that they understand what these obligations are, what the time frame is that they have to comply with those obligations, and what that entails on their end that they have to do.
I haven't looked at as many FDDs as you have, obviously, but I've, over the course of a couple of decades, I've had a chance to look at quite a few of them. It appears to me that most of the obligation lists, most of the item 9s in the list of obligations are fairly similar from franchise to franchise, and they seem to be. There's a very much a norm in regard to what these expectations are. So I guess maybe you give a couple examples of the kind of obligations that are kind of normal and traditional in franchising, and maybe
I can go through the list. It's an actual list, but the guidelines require, the federal guidelines require that a franchisor put in item 9, and so it starts with site selection and acquisition of the lease, and then pre-opening purchases and leases is B. C is site development and other pre-opening requirements. What this is a chart or a table, and it shows each of these lists of items where it is in the agreement, the franchise agreement, which, as I said, is the contract, and which disclosure document item it refers back to. So there's a chart that shows these lists with each of the agreement sections in it and the disclosure sections. So going through that list, we were up to site development. Then there's the training. They have an obligation to go through training, what their obligations are on opening their business, fees, what their obligations regarding compliance with any standards and policies, for example, the operations manual, what their obligations are regarding trademarks and proprietary information. And most of those are okay. Those are things that most franchisees are comfortable with. Now we're getting into restrictions on the products and services offered. So there, the item in the disclosure would be obviously item 8 that we just talked about, and then whatever section in the agreement it refers back to. Warranties and customer service requirements, territorial development and sales quotas, and then it continues on. I think some of the issues that really are to a franchisee or prospective franchisee to understand is what are the requirements if it's a brick and mortar to maintain it and remodel in the future. And typically most franchise agreements require, for example, that if the franchisor requires remodeling, let's use the example that I did the last time where we talked about McDonald's, since everybody knows McDonald's. If you look around, the McDonald's around the countries are all being remodeled. They look a little different than they did certainly in the 50s, and they look a little different than they did in the 1970s, and they look a little different than they did even, 10, 15 years ago. And that's because there's a right in their agreements for McDonald's to say, this is how we want you to look now. It's, we want a fresher look. We want different colors. They just remodeled what Ronald McDonald looks like. So they changed his clothing, and they want the stores to reflect that. And so that can cost a lot of money, and I think that's something that it's very important for a prospective and an existing franchisee to understand, that a franchisor has that right to be able to require remodeling. They also can require a certain amount of advertising requirements, that you're required to do national advertising and put money into a national advertising fund, and maybe a local and a regional fund, and that there may be certain insurance requirements that you have, and requirements regarding staffing, and whether an owner is required to participate in actually running the business, or whether you can hire someone to run. All of that would be disclosed in Item 9.